Story 1. This story, I don't talk about it often. It's too raw, too real, and honestly, too terrifying to relive. But maybe telling it will help me finally shake the images that still haunt my dreams. It was about 5 years ago. I was working as a paramedic in a small town near the Texas-Mexico border. Our calls were mostly routine, car accidents, heart attacks, that kind of thing. But every so often, we'd get called out for something more sinister. When you live that close to the border, you hear stories about cartels, about the violence they bring with them. But it always felt distant, like it was something that happened to other people in other places. Until that night. It was late, around 11 p.m. My partner, Jose, and I were finishing up a quiet shift, getting ready to head back to the station. The radio crackled, and a voice came through, urgent, panicked. "We have a report of multiple gunshot wounds, mile marker 46, just off the highway. First responders needed immediately." We looked at each other. Mile marker 46 was in the middle of nowhere, a dirt road that led deep into the desert. There were no houses, no businesses, nothing but open land and desolation. Jose shook his head, already uneasy. "This feels wrong," he muttered, but duty called. We arrived about 20 minutes later, our headlights cutting through the pitch-black night. There was an old, rusted-out truck, riddled with bullet holes, parked off to the side. No police yet, just us. Jose and I grabbed our bags and cautiously approached the vehicle, the air thick with tension. As soon as we reached the truck, I saw the blood. A lot of blood. Slumped over the wheel was a man, mid-30s maybe, his face barely recognizable, torn apart by gunfire. In the back seat, there was another body, a young woman, maybe in her 20s. She was alive, barely. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, her face pale and streaked with tears and dirt. We sprang into action, but as soon as I opened the door to the back seat, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a duffel bag on the floor, partially unzipped. Inside, bricks of white powder, drugs, and a lot of them. My mind went blank for a second, but then everything clicked. This wasn't just some random shooting. This was cartel business, and we were standing right in the middle of it. Jose muttered a curse under his breath, glancing over his shoulder into the darkness, his hand trembling as he checked the woman's vitals. "We need to get out of here, man. Now!" But it was too late. The sound of tires crunching over gravel snapped me out of my daze. I looked up, and that's when I saw them. 3 black SUVs, slowly pulling up, their headlights flicking off as they came to a stop a few hundred feet away. My heart dropped into my stomach. I didn't need to see the faces to know who they were. Cartel. My mind raced. Should we run? Hide? But we were trapped, with nothing but open desert around us and no backup on the way. Jose looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "If we move, they'll kill us." Then, the SUV's doors opened. 5 men stepped out, dressed in black, armed to the teeth with assault rifles. They didn't say a word as they approached. I remember their faces, cold, emotionless, like this was just another day at the office for them. One of them, the leader, I assumed, walked up to us slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stared at the bodies, then at us, his eyes narrowing. My throat went dry. I could barely breathe. "You didn't see anything," he said, his voice low, calm, almost friendly. "You didn't hear anything. Understand?" I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body felt like it was made of lead. Jose, though, somehow managed to nod. We were just trying to help." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know. And now, you're going to leave. Forget about this. And if I ever see either of you again, well, I think you know what'll happen." He didn't have to elaborate. We got the message loud and clear. Without another word, Jose and I backed away, our hearts pounding, sweat pouring down our faces. We didn't even load the woman into the ambulance. We left her there, still clinging to life, because we knew if we stayed any longer, we'd be next. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, the darkness swallowing us whole as we put as much distance between ourselves and that scene as possible. We never reported what we saw. There was no point. People who got involved with cartel business, they didn't last long. The police didn't ask any questions either. They knew. A week later, I found out the bodies had been found, but there was no mention of the drugs, no mention of the cartel. Just 2 more names added to the list of victims in a town that had learned to keep its mouth shut. I left that job not long after. Jose did too. We both knew we'd gotten lucky that night. But I still think about that woman bleeding out in the back of that truck. I wonder if she made it, or if she was just another casualty in a war that nobody talks about. Story 2. This story still makes me feel like I'm being watched, even though it's been years. I was younger then, 24, trying to make a living in the city, doing whatever odd jobs I could find. One of those jobs, well, let's just say it changed my life in ways I never saw coming. I had been working as a delivery driver for a small, family-owned logistics company on the south side of Chicago. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I got to keep to myself most of the time. The deliveries were always legit, at first. Regular stuff, restaurant supplies, furniture, nothing unusual. But after about 6 months, I started noticing strange requests. It was little things at first. Deliveries late at night, no return addresses, instructions to leave the package and go. Then the packages themselves started getting weirder, small, heavy boxes, always wrapped in plain brown paper, taped up tight. I didn't think much of it. I just did my job. But deep down, I had a feeling that something wasn't right. One night, my boss, Sal, this old-school, rough-around-the-edges guy who always had a cigar hanging out of his mouth, pulled me aside. "I've got a special run for you tonight," he said, his voice low. "Big payout. But you don't ask questions, got it?" I knew better than to push back. In this part of town, you didn't ask questions. So, I nodded, grabbed the keys, and headed to the warehouse. When I got there, a black van was parked outside, engine idling. A guy I'd never seen before, dressed in all black, opened the back and started loading crates into my truck. No labels, no markings, just plain wooden crates. The guy didn't say a word, just gave me a nod when he was done, then walked off into the shadows. I checked the address, a rundown nightclub on the outskirts of town, deep in a neighborhood known for its connections to organized crime. My gut told me to turn back, to make up an excuse and bail on the delivery. But the money was too good, so I hit the gas. The whole drive, I felt this growing sense of dread. The streets were empty, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I pulled up to the club, it was around 1 a.m., and the place looked deserted. The neon sign flickered above the door, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked pavement. The windows were blacked out, and there were no cars in the lot. I stepped out of the truck and knocked on the back door, just like the instructions said. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, my knuckles echoing in the quiet night. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, built like a bulldozer, wearing a slick black suit that barely fit his frame. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of a dimly lit room, shadows moving inside, but no faces. The man looked me up and down, his face blank. "You got the stuff?" His voice was deep, slow. I nodded and pointed to the truck. He motioned for me to unload. As I started pulling the crates off, I noticed the man wasn't alone anymore. 2 more guys had stepped out, both wearing the same dark suits, both with the same cold, dead expressions. They watched me in silence as I worked, their eyes never leaving me. When I unloaded the last crate, the big guy stepped forward and popped it open with a crowbar. Inside were stacks of cash, neat, clean bundles of $100 bills, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. My heart started pounding, but I tried to keep my cool. I didn't want them to see me sweat. "You didn't look inside, did you?" the big guy asked, his eyes narrowing. "And no," I stammered. "I just drive the truck." He stared at me for a long moment, like he was trying to decide whether he believed me. Then, finally, he nodded. "Smart. Now, get out of here." I didn't need to be told twice. I climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and peeled out of the parking lot, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting those guys to follow me, but the road behind me stayed empty. The next day, I went into work, trying to act normal. But as soon as I stepped into the office, I knew something was off. The usual noise of phones ringing, people talking, the hum of the fax machine, everything was dead silent. Sal wasn't at his desk. No one was. The place was a ghost town. I walked into the back toward the break room and stopped cold. The door to Sal's office was wide open, and there was a pool of blood on the floor. A lot of blood. My heart raced. I didn't need to go inside to know what had happened. So I'd gotten in too deep with the wrong people. That last delivery? It wasn't just cash. It was a payment to settle a debt. A debt that, apparently, Sal couldn't pay in full. I turned and walked out, forcing myself not to run. I got in my truck and drove, trying to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. I never went back. Never picked up another delivery. I quit that night and left town the next day, cutting ties with everyone I knew in that part of the city. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that Sal's body had been found in the river. No one was surprised, but what haunted me was the thought that if I had asked too many questions or made one wrong move that night, I might have ended up in that river too. And the worst part? I never knew what was really in those crates. Story 3. This is something I never planned on telling anyone, but I guess it's time. It happened when I was living in a small village in the mountains of southern Mexico. I was there on a work assignment for a nonprofit organization, supposed to be helping build infrastructure in these remote communities. Most days were quiet, peaceful even, with the local villagers always smiling, always welcoming. But that peace? It was fragile, very fragile. I'd been there about 6 months when whispers started. People talked in hushed voices, always looking over their shoulders. Some of the men would disappear for days at a time, coming back with grim faces and bloodshot eyes. It wasn't long before I found out why. A local militia group, a kind of paramilitary cartel, had set up camp in the mountains not far from the village. They called themselves Los Hijos del Fuego, the Sons of Fire. I'd heard of them before, but only in stories. Stories about how they controlled vast stretches of rural Mexico, running drugs, weapons, and people across the borders, using terror as their currency. They weren't just a cartel, they were a movement, and they thrived on brutality. At first, their presence was distant, just rumors of trucks rolling through the mountains at night, or strange men in military gear seen on the outskirts of the village. But soon enough, the rumors became real. The village elders called a meeting one evening, their faces lined with worry. They explained, quietly, that Los Hijos were coming, not just passing through. They were coming to take control. And once they arrived, everything would change. We were told to stay inside, keep our heads down, and for God's sake, don't try to run. Running would only make things worse. It wasn't long before they came. One night, I was sitting in the small house I rented, barely able to sleep, when I heard the distant rumble of engines. At first, I thought it was thunder, but then I heard it, the unmistakable growl of trucks, the low hum of motorcycles. I crept to the window and looked out. The road leading into the village was lit up by headlights, a convoy of black trucks, their windows tinted, dust kicking up in their wake. My heart raced as I saw men hanging off the sides of the trucks, carrying rifles, some with bandanas covering their faces. They didn't speak. They didn't shout. They moved like they owned the place. I pulled back from the window, my body shaking. I didn't know what to do. I had no way to leave, no way to call for help. Even if I could, who would come? This was their territory now. The truck stopped in the village square. I could hear doors opening and men's boots crunching on the gravel. Then came the gunfire. Not the rapid bursts of a firefight, but single shots, one after another, in steady succession. Bang, bang, bang. I shut my eyes and prayed they weren't killing anyone. But deep down, I knew better. I heard footsteps outside my door. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was out there, just standing. The handle turned slowly. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the only thing I could use as a weapon, a kitchen knife, and held it tight, hiding behind a flimsy wooden table. The door didn't open, though. Not all the way. Instead, whoever was out there just pushed something inside, a note. It fluttered to the floor, and the door clicked shut again. I waited, my heart pounding in my ears, until I was sure the footsteps had gone. When I finally mustered the courage to pick up the note, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it. Scrawled in rough handwriting, it read, "No eres de aquí. Mantente fuera de nuestro camino." You're not from here. Stay out of our way. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring at the note, wondering if they were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The next morning, the village was different. The people were out in the streets, but there was no life in their eyes. They went about their business quietly, like shadows of themselves. And in the square, bloodstains on the dirt road. They'd taken people in the night. I never found out who. No one dared to speak of it. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere grew heavier, darker. Los Hijos del Fuego weren't just a presence. They controlled everything now. They took what they wanted, when they wanted. Food, money, people. They recruited young men, forcing them to join their ranks. And those who refused, well, I never saw them again. One night, I made the decision. I had to leave. I packed what little I had, some clothes, a few essentials, and slipped out in the dead of night, praying I wouldn't be seen. The village was under their watch, but I knew a few back trails that led into the mountains, paths I hoped they hadn't discovered yet. As I walked, every sound made me jump, the rustling of the wind, the distant call of animals. But it was the silence that scared me the most. The silence felt wrong, like something was watching, waiting. After hours of walking, I heard it, the low hum of a motorcycle engine, creeping up from behind me. I dove into the brush, barely daring to breathe as the bike passed by, its headlights sweeping the narrow trail. I lay there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, until I was sure it was gone. By some miracle, I made it to a neighboring town by morning. Exhausted, hungry, but alive. I never went back to that village. In fact, I left Mexico altogether not long after. I still think about the people I left behind. I wonder what happened to them after Los Hijos came. I hear the group is still out there, growing stronger, more ruthless. Every now and then, I'll see something in the news, another village taken, another massacre in the mountains. And I wonder how close I came to being one of those stories. These stories are just a glimpse into the dark and twisted world of organized crime. It's a world where violence is a way of life, where survival depends on silence, and where stepping out of line means disappearing without a trace. The truth is, these kinds of horrors happen more often than most of us realize, hidden in the shadows, just out of sight. Stay aware, stay informed, and remember, while these stories may seem distant, the reality of organized crime affects us all. If you ever find yourself in a situation where something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. Staying safe sometimes means knowing when to walk away. Remember to like and subscribe. Also, check out my channel for more videos like this.